Okay, what I'm going to talk about today is really in three parts. The first part will introduce Headless, the project, because a lot of people won't know it, and it's quite an involved project. I can't cover everything, because Headless has been running since 2007, as Joanna probably just said, but I don't understand what she was saying. And I've been involved with it since 2008. So what I will do is just really explain my involvement with it, and how that feeds into the novel, Looking for Headless, copies of which are upstairs, or bits of which are upstairs. Then I will segue into Renaissance paradoxy, and I hope the reason for doing that will become clear as time goes on. The main reason for doing it for me is that I'm actually fascinated by Renaissance paradox. There was a huge flowering of paradoxy during the Renaissance, some of which indeed Lindsay just referred to. And indeed, Jan Gondlerovich, if I pronounced that correctly, was talking about the paradox of the novel yesterday. So I just want to play around with the idea of paradox a little bit, and how it fits into Headless. And then in the third bit, hopefully, I will bring it all together and have some reflections on the novel itself. My title here, Being Nothing, is a paradox in itself. Clearly, you cannot be nothing. It's not possible. And it's stolen from Shakespeare, and I'll allude to the quote more directly later. It's from Richard II. But before I get into it, one thing that I think is very important, and I do this now because so many people actually doubt that I am who I say I am. I don't know why they doubt my identity, but it's real. I'm not an artist. I'm not a performance artist. I'm not an author. I'm not a fictional author. I write academic stuff. I do work in a school of management and teach students about management, sort of. Very badly, I should think, but there you go. To allude to what Lindsay was saying at the end there about truth, I am true. Pretty much everything else is fiction of one kind or another, but as far as Headless is concerned, I'm the one true bit. I am actually who I say I am. So, without further ado, I think we'd better start. And this is me starting at the end. This is an extract from the novel, from page 157, of the novel Looking for Headless by the fictional author K.D. And the photograph here is me reading these words out as a preface to a lecture I gave in London Zoo in September 2010. The words are mine in the novel, but I did not write them. The chapter of the novel that I'm reading out from here was written prior to the event it describes. So the photograph is of the event as it happened, in which I gave a lecture in London Zoo, which I really did in September 2010. But a part of that lecture was a description of the event written prior to the event, and partly with my words, partly with the words of K.D., this fictional author, and partly with the words of other people contributing to the novel in various ways. And I'll come on to explain, insofar as I know myself, how that writing process works. But just to reread the words from the novel, because it actually describes really accurately what I do. My name is Angus Cameron, and we're here in the slightly incongruous setting of London Zoo for a talk on fiction and sovereignty. I say incongruous, but in fact we'll see that there are good reasons for being here rather than, say, in a stuffy lecture hall. As you may or may not know, I've been collaborating with the artists Goldin+Senneby on their Headless project for a few years now. I'm one of a number of spokespersons they've had since the project began, although I prefer the term emissary. I don't speak for them, I speak for myself in their place. That last point is actually me being highly pedantic, but it's true. I mean, I am the true one, after all. I do not speak for them. They do not tell me what to say. They haven't told me what to say here. I do not represent them in any direct sense. I merely occupy their place. Headless as a project, as I said at the outset, is vast. It's involved hundreds of people over the past 5 or 6 years. Some of them are directly involved, like me, although I do not become involved in every aspect of the project. Some are very actively involved, some are not very actively involved. They sort of hit the project and disappear off again. Some know they're part of the project and are very happy about it. Some know they're part of the project and are very, very unhappy about it, to the point of lawyers. Some don't know they're part of the project and yet appear in project documentation. Some are real, some are fictional. Some of the real ones aren't quite as real as they seem, except me, obviously. Some of the fictional ones are partly based on real people. So the project has grown in this tentacular way to embrace all these many people. And I don't have time to go into every aspect of that here. So what I'm going to do is really just trace my particular contribution to the project, partly, as I say, because that's what I know best, and it's what I have the images for, but it's only a part of the project. The main output that we're considering today is this, which is the front cover at the moment of the novel Looking for Headless. There are many, many different versions of this in circulation, and the reason for that is that as the project has unfolded since 2007, the artists have published the chapters as they emerge, and the chapters are written in response to the activities in the project. This is a very important one for me anyway. This is the first chapter. This is chapter 1, as it was in 2008 when I first got involved in the project. And this was the first thing given to me when I joined the project in 2008. And as you'll see, rather importantly, not just coincidentally, but conceptually, the name of the author has been scrubbed out. We've had a lot of concerns about authorship over the last day and a half, and Headless has a significant problem with authorship for all sorts of reasons. This was not a theoretical gesture, however, the scrubbing out of the name. It was a legal one. The name that's been excised here is of a real person who worked for, and maybe still does work for, an offshore finance agency based in Gibraltar called Sovereign Trust, whom Goldin+Senneby had followed by a Spanish private detective and started to weave her life, her real life, unbeknownst to her, into the novel. Sovereign Trust got to hear about this and put lawyers on them, and the lawyers insisted that the name was removed from the novel, which is why at this stage, this is just after the threatening letter had arrived, they just scribble them out with a pen. In subsequent versions of the novel, you'll see the initials KD, which are the initials of that person, but obviously without direct attribution. In other versions of the novel, you'll see the name Kelly Duncan, who's an entirely made-up person who does not exist. As far as I know, there must be a Kelly Duncan somewhere. Maybe she writes novels, who knows? And in some places, it's just completely blank. But usually it resolves to KD, and KD seems now to be the author. So this is one very early version of this serially produced novel that's still very much in the making. This is an excerpt from it. This is one of the few excerpts that's actually remained constant throughout all the versions of the novel, and this is my arrival as a character. It's not me, clearly. It's a fictional version of me, or it's a fictional version of someone bearing my name and institutional attribution. But spookily, this person does speak the same words that I spoke in this room in Tower 42 in London on March 28th, 2008. This is the Regis offices in London. Regis is used by Goldin+Senneby for a lot of the performances and events around Headless, because, if you don't know it, Regis is an organization from whom you can rent office space by the hour. If you're a business type and you're flying in from wherever you are to wherever you want to have your meeting, you can organize a boardroom and all your business types can get around that boardroom for an hour and have a meeting as though it was your own office. Regis offices all over the world are pretty much identical, and this is the one in Tower 42. They have these shield-shaped tables, and in 2008 we all sat around this, a group of us, curators, artists, academics, journalists, but not the artists, Goldin+Senneby, who never appear at their own events, and we talked about offshore finance for exactly 2 hours. And the reason I was there was because in my real life, I'd written a book on offshore finance, and so I was there as an expert. Heaven help them. Anyway, here I am arriving in the novel, and we were not aware of anybody taping this event in 2008, but this is verbatim what I said. Angus Cameron, University of Leicester, shifts in his chair and exhales audibly. Years of faculty meetings have taught him how to get attention. I haven't read Bataille, he says slowly, thinking his words through before speaking, his stocky rugby player's body rocking slightly as he seems to wrestle slow-mo with each thought. But with reference to offshore, it's not about secrecy, it's privacy. We're private here, not secret. Now, one of the important aspects of this, to me, is that I've never met the person who wrote these words. Okay, I've said some of these words, and whoever it is wrote them down, but I have never met this person in person. So how he knows about my stocky rugby player's body is beyond me, but there you go. It's eerily accurate, which is can be uncomfortable. But this is my entry into the novel, or my fictional version's entry into the novel, which then proliferates as the story of Headless is worked through. And just to fill you in on the backstory, where the name Headless comes from, on your right-hand side, the blue paper is the incorporation certificate for a company called Headless Limited, which was incorporated in the Bahamas in 2007, and is, as you can see at the top, an international business company, an IBC. IBCs are what corporations and wealthy individuals set up to hide their money from the taxman, basically. If you are super wealthy, I hope you all are, and you want to keep hold of it, you organize through an agent like Sovereign Trust, for example, based in Gibraltar, which is what happened here, to set up a shell company somewhere else in a tax haven, in this case the Bahamas. You often also have a blind trust somewhere that will own the company, so you get layers and layers and layers of secrecy, which is why I'm talking about secrecy in Tower 42. And then you can hide your wealth from any taxman. You can hide everything you want, really, behind these companies. It's a sort of structure used by the likes of Apple, News International. All these big companies use this kind of structure. The story of Headless is called Looking for Headless, because one of the things we are all, at least in theory, doing is looking for this company. We are all set out into the world by Goldin+Senneby to find this company, without any real hope of finding it, because by definition they are highly private, secret things. But there's also a backstory, which is on the left-hand side of the screen, which is from Georges Bataille, the French sociologist, theorist, sort of proto- or quasi-surrealist, who in 1937-ish set up an organization called Acéphale, which is French for headless. Acéphale was a secret society. It was supposed to be a secret society that was in some way anti-fascist. You can see here it's got Nietzsche and the fascists on this front cover. And it had a rather confused, or rather confusing, philosophy based on Bataille's understanding of natural energetics. And Bataille firmly believed that you could establish a secret society that would release social energy through the act of beheading, not a metaphorical act, a literal act. And one of the things that Acéphale was going to do was to actually behead someone in a forest near Paris. And in doing this, through this ritual act, would suddenly unleash the energies of French society against fascism. It was all rather confused and confusing. Bataille himself, I gather, was going to be the victim, as it were, but none of his fellow Acéphale members would do it. And in any event, 1939 came along, the war arrived, and Acéphale rather died, or did it? Because what the project Headless suggests is that there may be a connection between Bataille's secret society from the 1930s and some way morphing into this kind of secret organization in 2007. Is there, therefore, a connection between Bataille's Acéphale and Goldin+Senneby's Headless? And so the project is really trying to conceptually trace any connections, any possible links between the two. And whether there are links or not doesn't really matter, but it's the act of looking that seems to be the most important aspect of it. My bit in looking for this has been multifarious. These are some of the events I've participated in, and all of these are in some way or another integrated into the narrative of the novel. It all gets quite confusing, but I'll try and make it as clear as I can. This is me again in 2008, sitting in my office at Leicester University. This is when I used to be in the geography department, not in the management school. I've moved since. And as you can see, I am reading from the novel. And this was me reading out, this was after the meeting in Tower 42, this is I think in October that year, and they'd written up the chapter, and this is me reading out my description, the whole rugby player thing that I just read. This is me reading it into a camera, and the camera is making a documentary. There's a documentary film about Headless too. Headless appears in all sorts of different formats. The documentary is by Richard John Jones and Kate Cooper, and has traced many aspects of the project and is now completed and out there. I think you can find it. I put this image up not just because it's me, but because if you can look in the background there, there's two images of a fool's cap with the cap and bells. The bluish one is the cover of a book I wrote in 2004 called The Imagined Economies of Globalization, which talks about offshore finance, and that's the reason I ended up being part of the project. And here I am in the documentary being a, quote, expert, and so I'm being interviewed for my expertise on offshore finance. Such as it is. But then the other image of the fool's cap up there is actually the British Library's copy of this particular print. And it's a print that fascinates me and has accompanied me over many, many years, and now gets incorporated into Headless. And I just use that to illustrate the way that the project kind of draws aspects of your life in, and it all becomes incorporated into many aspects of the project as it unfolds. Now, you probably can't see it, but just on that shelf thing there is the Fool's Cap map, and this came after that interview, and I turned up, this is actually in Toronto in December 2008, and I turned up to find myself incorporated into this installation in all sorts of ways that I hadn't expected. I should say, by the way, nobody ever told us we were going to be written into a novel, those of us who are part of this. That came as a bit of a surprise, and still does. But anyway, the Fool's Cap map appears, and that appears through many exhibitions subsequently. This was their first major exhibition in North America, devoted to Headless, and in this room they had various artifacts from Headless, texts from Bataille, images by their designers and curators. On this side, just where the arrow is, that is a transcription of an article I wrote for the Sao Paulo Metro newspaper at their behest. They exhibited Headless in a different form, indeed a different written form, a novella form, which I've just been explaining to David and Jana, because they're going to have to collect that now too. And alongside this, they had me write articles for the Sao Paulo Metro on offshore finance, and I had to write 850-word articles across 8 weeks, and then they transcribed one of those into the exhibition. So every part of Headless as a project gets put in the mix and becomes part of the exhibited and installed and mobile form. The door at the back, on the other side of that door, is a huge screen, and on that screen is running the documentary film that I just showed you a still from on a constant loop. And so I appear and other characters from Headless appear in the film, in the room, in objects, all over the place. It's sort of all pervasive. Following from that, in that room I also gave a lecture. It was the first performance lecture I gave for Goldin+Senneby, which is still available on YouTube or video, Vimeo somewhere if you're feeling very brave. But that then subsequently triggered a whole series of lecture performances which culminated in the one in the zoo in 2010. This is one we did in Stockholm. This is the Index Gallery in Stockholm, tiny little gallery into which crammed about 70 people to listen to, well, we're not quite sure. On this side, you have the head of Kim Einarsson, who is a Stockholm-based curator who's worked a lot with Goldin+Senneby. After the lecture I did in Toronto, sorry, this gets a bit intricate, she interviewed me and then turned that interview into a play, 2 plays, in fact, in at least one of which I am shown wearing a corduroy suit, which is a very strange thing to imagine altogether. But one of the versions is what we are doing here. I actually transcribed the interview, and then we redid the interview on the stage in Stockholm. In the audience is an actress who re-asked a question that was asked of me in Toronto. And the reason it was re-asked was because nobody understood it, and it went on for hours, and so they decided they would do it twice. So I got this question again, and I've had it subsequently again as well. So if any of you are armed with it, please don't. It will happen again. But this was a very intense event because the audience really did not understand what was going on, because it was clear that we were reading from script. Well, Kim was reading from script. I'm a terrible actor, so I did not read from a script. I just extemporized. But it was clear that there were people planted in the audience, and it all got very, very intense because nobody quite knew what was going on, which is very much part of the way the project works. It's constantly displacing the event that's taking place. Subsequent to that, this is in May 2010. This is the forest where Bataille and his strange friends would go and enact their rituals as Asifal. And my part was to deliver a 3-part lecture walking through the forest with this trail of a rather odd collection of artists, curators, bankers, accountants, and all sorts. This was a talk called The Decapitation of Money. And that title came from my Toronto lecture. And so the way Goldin+Senneby and I kind of interact is that they will pick on something I've said. They will then hand it back to me and say, right, go and talk about that next, which makes me very careful now what I say in any of these events. That then led the following day to this installation. That talk in the forest was recorded. It was then edited overnight, translated, and then turned into, where are they, subtitles on this screen. The space you're looking at here is the Cardist Gallery in Montmartre in Paris, and the lines on the wall are a hand-drawn map of the forest that was drawn by Bataille himself for his followers so they wouldn't get lost. Through the door is a mock-up of a Russian bank based in Paris in the 1950s. And the reason for that is that the offshore finance, I won't go into detail here, but it emerges from various decisions and non-decisions taken in the 1950s. But one of the key institutions was the Moscow Bank in Paris, or the Russian Bank in Paris, which is where we get the term Eurodollar, because they invented it. And what this talk did, and is reflected in the novel, is to try and draw together Bataille's energies with the energies of money, and this idea of decapitating money, releasing its energy, and relating back to capital. And this is an installation that now travels all over the world. Their installations don't just appear and disappear, they are reproduced, and this one's been all over the place. And most recently, it was in Cairo a few weeks ago. If you sit in this room and you sit in the dark, you hear a recording of my lecture on a loop. It must drive the gallery people up the wall, but there you go. And all that culminated back in London Zoo in September 2010. And so this is me delivering the lecture in the zoo, and like the previous one, it was then it was recorded, edited, and then put into an installation. In this case, for the Moderna exhibition at the Moderna Museet in Stockholm in 2010. The title here, which was also the title of the lecture, "Each thing seen as the parody of another is the same in a deceptive form," is the first line of, I think it's the Solar Anus, which is one of Bataille's more notorious writings. And what I was asked to do in this particular one was to reflect on Bataille and reflect on sovereignty. If you remember the first slide, it was talking about sovereignty and offshore finance and whatever else. The rock is a vague, very vague mock-up of the Rock of Gibraltar, because Gibraltar is a tax haven, and Gibraltar is where the sovereign trust is located that incorporated Headless Limited. Another aspect of the project is that Sovereign Trust also runs several international art prizes. The chief executive of Sovereign Trust is an avid art collector and is very much engaged in contemporary art, and one of the things the project reflects on is the relationship between offshore finance, the bonus culture in the banks, and contemporary art markets. And so all of that was kind of folded into this talk in one way or another. Again, this installation, I think now is in part of the permanent collection in Stockholm, features my lecture on a permanent loop. The child at the top there, who looks slightly as though she's screaming, has her head next to the loudspeaker out of which emanates my words of wisdom. So she's risking serious brain damage there. But this, again, is about thinking about place. You're supposed to sit on the rock and look at your reflection and then to think about what I'm saying. The reason, by the way, we were in London Zoo, if I didn't mention it before, was that Bataille had an epiphany in London Zoo in front of the macaque house in 1929, and he wrote a series of pieces after this experience of watching the monkeys. And the reason he was interested in the monkeys was they did not have reason, they didn't fear death, they didn't think about their position, they simply got on with stuff. And of course the macaques, in case you're not aware, also inhabit the Rock of Gibraltar, and so it's wound up with notions of British sovereignty and British power. I won't go into that now. So I've been incorporated into this project, and it's all been written up in the novel in this very strange, accretive, and displacing way. Nobody's quite sure what's true, except me, obviously, and it produces this very paradoxical effect, because you have the novel, you have the chapters, you have the writing, but you don't necessarily know who's written it or what the purpose is. Paradoxy is something I'm particularly interested in my own work, separate from Goldin+Senneby, because we live with paradox all the time, and I'll come and talk about that in a minute. It's something that's very common in conceptual art and contemporary art. Much of it uses paradox in order to reflect on particular things, and we tend to associate it with contemporary art, but in fact it has a very long history. And what I want to do just now is to kind of step away from Headless for a little bit and just think about paradoxy, because it speaks both to conceptual art more generally, but specifically to Headless as the novel, and I think to the artist novel more generally. Now, here at this point, I have to apologize to the translators, because this is almost impossible to read, even if your first language is English. It was written by John Donne. It was, in fact, written in 1601, at a time when spelling, punctuation, and grammar were optional. So it's very, very hard to read. The reason I put it here is because actually it rewards you if you read it, if you work with it. But it's also the best articulation of the use of paradox and what paradox can do as a communicative tactic that I've ever found. And it's an extraordinarily beautiful bit of writing. I'm not going to read it all because it's too complicated. But I did just highlight these red sections. Because he's trying to explain why he uses the paradox, and he's actually explaining it in a paradoxical way, because he doesn't quite directly allude to why he's using them. So he's sending these paradoxes to his friend, and he says they carry with them a confession of their lightness. In other words, they say stuff, but they also say it lightly. It's about being trivial, inconsequential. There is nothing here. And further down, they are but swaggerers, quiet enough if you resist them. So they seem to have substance. They swagger into your line of sight. They seem to be saying something, but then if you examine them, they just fall apart. They dissolve into nothing. And finally, they have only the advantage to escape from being called ill things that they are no things. In other words, they seem to deal with controversial topics. A lot of the paradoxy you find in John Donne's poetry, for example, he will write reflections on the flea. One of his most famous poems is called The Flea. So using great art to describe something utterly trivial, a single flea, but finding in that extraordinary truths at the same time. But he uses the capacity of the paradox to collapse in on itself and to become nothing. So it looks like he's saying grand things, but in fact, ultimately he's claiming, he's saying nothing at all. Now, this, of course, is not true. If you read John Donne's poems, they're extremely profound and very moving. They don't just collapse into nothing. But if you try and really examine what they're saying, the paradoxes fall apart. Now, while we associate that, sorry, come on back to that. This is picked up in this extraordinary book by Rosalie Kali, written in 1966. Very tragically, she died shortly after this book was published, called Paradoxia Epidemica, which is an incredibly eloquent analysis of Renaissance paradox. And I'll just read the quote out, because it says something, I think, very directly to the artist's novel, and particularly to Headless. The paradox does not commit itself, nor does the paradoxist. Another reason why, in the melee of Renaissance ideas, there was a paradoxical epidemic, affording man the chance to postpone a philosophical or religious choice he might live to regret. Indeed, the paradoxical form denies commitment, breaking out of imprisonment by disciplinary forms and the regulation of schools. It denies limitation, defies citing in any specific philosophical position. One of the reasons I particularly like the paradox is because, as an academic, I don't have a particular philosophical position and I don't have a particular discipline. I'm anti-disciplinary in every possible sense. But this also is very much the way contemporary art works, breaking the boundaries, denying the boundaries, bursting the boundaries. It had a rather more direct and personal function in the Renaissance, because if you stepped out of the paradox and said things a little too bluntly, you got your head chopped off. One of the more famous paradoxists, Thomas More, for example, the author of Utopia, which is a profoundly paradoxical work, did just that, and Henry VIII chopped his head off. So in the Middle Ages, you had to be very careful what you said. One of the reasons Kali, in her book, gives for the flowering of Renaissance paradoxy was that it allowed you to discuss very sensitive topics and do very difficult things. But it was also instituted in the government as well. The image here is of Will Somers, as it says. Will Somers, as some of you may know, was Henry VIII's fool. And the fool was an integral part of the British court, the jester, the joker. And the reason the fool is so important is that the fool is the only person who can mock the king. And the fool is there as a paradoxical element of government, who is there to be at the king's side but mocking the king, to have the power of a king but no power at all. So you get the idea of the fool as the wise fool, the idea that fools have wisdom. There's a huge literature on this. I won't go into it too much. But Will Somers became very important because as Henry VIII got older, madder, and more dangerous, he was an incredibly violent man, Will Somers ended up being the only person who could talk to Henry VIII and calm him down. And Somers had this very paradoxical position. Somers was part of the court. He was very wealthy. He was very well paid. But he slept with the dogs. Literally slept with the dogs. He slept with the spaniels. And so he lived a paradoxical life as part of the Renaissance court. So we may not have to do all that, but contemporary art and artist novels carry something of that crashing together of ideas. Again, just sticking with Renaissance paradoxy for a moment, this is where my title comes from. This is from Richard II by Shakespeare, wonderful play. And this is a section in which the eponymous Richard II is agonizing over his identity. In the course of the play, he is deposed by Henry Bolingbroke, based on a historical event. And what he's doing here is reflecting on his own position as his identity, as his world crumbles. So with apologies to Shakespeare, thus play I in one person many people. And that particular line is very close to my heart because as Headless has evolved, I've become many people in one person, and so my identity is proliferated all over the place. Thus I play in one person many people and none contented. Sometimes am I king, then treasons make me wish myself a beggar, and so I am. Then crushing penury persuades me I was better when a king, then am I kinged again. And by think that I am unkinged by Bolingbroke, and straight am nothing. But whate'er I be, nor I, nor any man that but man is, with nothing shall be pleased, till he be eased with being nothing. It's a profoundly paradoxical construction, but what he's arguing is that because of our multiple and dispersed selves, we only reconcile ourselves once we realize that we are nothing. And so being nothing is a tactic that allows us to cope with the vagaries of reality and the shifting nature of our identity. The reason, one of the reasons, excuse me, that I'm particularly interested in paradoxy, and this brings us back towards Headless, is that we all live with paradoxy all the time because we have it in our pockets. Money is probably the single most paradoxical object we encounter on a daily basis. We kind of think we know what it is, but actually when you start to analyze money, its reality dissipates. Money is nothing. These are two events, images related to Joseph Beuys, who in his later years became obsessed with money and its relationship to art. Nothing to do with art markets. The reason he was obsessed with money was because he felt, his writings on this are rather obscure, but it seems to be that what he wanted art to become was like money, a universal currency that everyone had access to. And this quote comes from a symposium, not dissimilar to this one, that he organized in 1984. It was only published in English in 2010, called What is Money? And Beuys himself was part of this, and he brought a bunch of bankers and financiers together to talk in public in Ulm, in Germany, about what is money. And this is a quote not from Beuys himself, but from Rainer Willert, who was a banker who was present at the event. What is money? Nothing. That's the only possible answer, but it works. Money works because in our heads, yes, we don't think of it as nothing. And because our entire networks of institutions, here I'll mention only banks and the pricing system, emerge from this same falsehood and establish themselves on its basis, making it their business to hide this nothingness from view. Wonderfully paradoxical notion of hiding nothingness from view. I love that. So money works. And its most important work is to secure its future. In other words, to make sure we go on desiring it in the future too. Our entire economy is revolving around nothing at all. And so nothing has become a very important part of Headless and a very important part of our entire economy. Just as an aside, one of the first events I did for Goldin+Senneby as the emissary spokesperson in 2008 was in September of that year when Lehman Brothers collapsed and banks were going all over the place. And we were in a gallery in South London, and many people in the audience were from the finance community. And so we had this very odd collision of worlds taking place in that room, which produced its own particular tension. It was rather good fun. The image at the top is one of a whole series of banknotes that Beuys produced over many years, which plays around with the notion of value. He writes the text Kunst equals capital, art is capital, on the note, and then signs it. In doing that, he destroys the note. He destroys its value. This is no longer 20 Swiss francs because he's scribbled over it and put his name on it. He then steals its identity. He writes over the face of whoever is supposed to represent the state and adds his own signature. But of course, in destroying its value, he massively multiplies it because Joseph Beuys' signature alone is worth tens of thousands of francs or dollars or lira or whatever it was that he signed. So here is Beuys paradoxically using the paradox of money to destroy and massively increase its fictional value and play around with the very idea of what currency is. So back to Headless. What does all that mean in terms of Headless? The way the artists Goldin+Senneby describe their relationship to the work is as an act of withdrawal, or as a series of acts of withdrawal. And one of the things you have to get used to if you work with them is that they don't turn up to their own events, which is interesting, if slightly off-putting when you first encounter it. Then again, they're such control freaks, they'd be a pain in the neck if they did turn up, so I'm quite glad they don't. But that notion of withdrawal runs through Headless in every aspect. And probably the only person who doesn't withdraw from Headless is me, because I can't. I actually have to physically turn up and speak. So I'm probably the exception to the Headless rule here. This is a section from the novel where the novelist, John Barlow, who was a real novelist, who is British but lives in Spain, and who may or may not be the author of this novel, where Barlow, who is written into the novel by Barlow, agonizes about his role and identity as part of Headless. No one was giving him answers. No one was here to help, certainly not Goldin+Senneby, whose physical absence from their own work had begun to be questioned not just by Barlow, but also by those who talked to him about Headless. So what was he, the writer, John Barlow? A joke, a bodily presence that merely emphasized the absence of the artists? And what about the novel? Was he still under contract to write a novel? And this is a large part of the narrative of the novel is Barlow being hassled by this rather glamorous international we don't quite know what she is. She's either the police or a spy or an agent or something, who chases him around and threatens him with photographs of headless corpses and suggests that he's implicated in a murder and all this kind of stuff. The image was actually taken by Barlow in the Bahamas. When I was sitting in 2008 in Tower 42 talking about offshore finance, at the exact same moment, Barlow was blogging this image from the Bahamas because he'd been sent there to look for Headless. And the image, the blue bit of paper I showed you at the beginning, the incorporation papers of Headless Limited, were found by Barlow in the Bahamas. So he was in the Bahamas while we were sitting in London talking about the Bahamas. So again, crashing all this stuff together in this wonderfully paradoxical way. Here again, this is a rather sneaky insight into the writing process, which I actually know very little about, and I know I'm slightly involved in it, but not very much. Just to read the quote from the novel again. Again, this is Barlow agonizing about himself, which he does a lot. However, what actually happened with the novel was that the story avoided the novelist completely. John Barlow failed to write Headless, and someone else had to do it for him. I rather like that notion of the story avoiding the novelist. It seems to me a lot of artist novels do just that. They produce novels while avoiding the novelist, certainly that kind of romantic notion of the novelist as a wise monad. And someone else had to do it. Someone else in the novel is me. I take over from John Barlow and finish the novel. And my appearance in London Zoo is me at a point where the contradictions of that become too great, and I have variously, I have a nervous breakdown, and in one version at least, I'm attacked by Barlow. And the reason I know this is because Barlow is on Twitter and took it upon himself to tweet at the point where he was persuaded to stab me in the chest. In the novel. So I'll read, I don't know if you can read them, but I'll read them from the top. This appeared in, when is it, June last year. And I just happened to pick it up and answered it, but it gives you some indication of how this thing is produced. John Barlow. I've just been persuaded to fictionally knife Angus Cameron a great deal harder and deeper in the chest than I'd intended. Me. Sounds like you were pretty easily persuaded then. You couldn't have gone for light grazing with an option on bruises. Barlow. It was me that got it down to a grazed arm in a previous draft. Goldin+Senneby were having none of it. I did miss the vital organs, though. And then finally, well, at least my organs are okay. That's a comfort, sort of. Bloody Scandinavians, though. Can't trust them. In there, probably, is the only direct insight you'll get into how this novel is written. And I did not know that they were communicating with each other about this. This is one of only 2 occasions in which I have been consulted by Barlow over my treatment in the novel. The other was just before the event in London Zoo. And so the authorship of this thing is shifting. It's changing. It is authored, it is controlled, but it shifts around, and we all chip in even if we don't necessarily know we're doing it. And coming towards the end now, this is another quote from Paradoxia Epidemica, which seems again to describe something very particular about the paradox that works, but also something about the paradoxical state of the artist's novel. Paradox relies utterly upon its action in audience or beholder or reader, you lot. Or me, I suppose, as well. Paradox requires a beholder willing to share in its action, and by thus sharing in it, to prolong that action. Always about being, the paradox is not fully ontological. since by drawing attention to its own form and technique, it demands a wanderer. This is another quote from Donne, by the way. A reader to admire it and to wonder about it. Paradox must, in short, generate thought and even understanding. Just thinking about what Simon Morris was talking about yesterday, and what pretty much everyone has talked about, this notion that the artist novel is somehow incomplete. There are complete things, there's a whole bunch of them up there, but they lack something that a normal, quotes, novel seems to have. Or maybe they have something that a normal novel doesn't quite have. And I love this quote from Kali. I don't quite agree with her. I do think the artist novel and the paradox are fully ontological, but they're not ontological on our terms. They have a reality which is other than our terms. We tend to accept reality as a fixed given thing. The modern world tends to deal with fixed ideas that are real, that are true. But what the artist novel does, what the paradox does, is to open up a space between, a space that has historically been described by using the paradox of nothing, but is not no thing. It is not empty. It contains multiple possibilities, multiple directions, and is therefore radically different from a conventional modernist ontology. And just back to the novel, what does it ultimately achieve? This is John Barlow again in the novel, agonizing about the novel and himself. Nothing at all had happened for sure. Nothing is anything with Headless. Asifal had not been reconvened. Nothing, nothing, nothing. And that's it. Thank you.
Well, I would like to ask the audience if anyone has some questions. We can have some dialogue now. Okay, Jonah has a question.
One question. I want to ask you, what do you mean by antidisciplinarity?
Why am I antidisciplinary? I started out life with a degree in art history, and I then, in the 1980s, but that wasn't enough, so I moved into international political economy and international relations, and then I worked for 10 years in the geography department, and now I'm management. In all of that time, I have done exactly the same thing, in that my core concerns are spatiality, identity, narrative, performance, language, and these peculiar spaces in between. And the reason I've moved across the disciplines is because pretty much every time the disciplines became a constraint. And that's partly just because disciplines do that. They are called disciplines for a reason, but also partly because of the particular situation in British higher education at the minute, whereby we're being audited by government, and that puts quite strict boundaries around disciplinary space. There are certain things you can do in some disciplines and certain things you can't do. As a social scientist, you need to move around. You can't stay in the same place if you want to continue doing your own thing. And so by shifting disciplines and being anti-disciplinary or simply non-disciplinary, I've been able to preserve my capacity to do exactly what I feel like doing at any given time. I sincerely hope my bosses are not listening to this. But it's a way of preserving your autonomy, really. I'm not sure, if I hadn't done that, I couldn't do Headless, because I would have such a crisis of identity by now. Because what Headless does is break through all the boundaries of identity and personhood and authorship and everything else. Just as an anecdote, where this came together most acutely was in an exhibition in which one of the installations was included in Nottingham Contemporary Gallery in Nottingham, near where I live. And because it was the first one that had ever happened near where I live, I actually went with my kids to the private view. And Goldin+Senneby weren't there, but the installation was. My voice was droning out of a loudspeaker. And so suddenly co-present in the room were all sorts of different me's. There was academic me, partly because there were other academics I know who were in the area who were at the thing. I was father me, because my kids were there running around, ignoring me completely and getting really excited by the tank of frogs next door. My partner was there, so I was partner me, and I was Goldin+Senneby me. And having them all in the room at the same time was an interesting experience that I think you need to be anti-disciplinary or non-disciplinary to fully be able to deal with.
Any more questions?
You got one there?
Who goes first?
Well, in a way, it's a follow-up. Yet the paradox is these otherwise refractory figures like Bataille, Kojève, who actually came from a banking family, ended up totally dominating one portion of the intellectual landscape and history of French culture. Do you think it's relevant? The question is relevant whether the kind of work, if I understand it correctly, that you critically do and events like this promote, which is much more marginalized with respect to a power structure, can have a similar effect?
I think the reason the likes of Bataille and Kojève have that power in France is perhaps something particular to the way French culture incorporates intellectualism, which doesn't happen in quite the same way in other places.
They also dominate American events.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a possibility for either myself in my academic life or Goldin+Senneby or us combined to be dominant in that sense, because we're simply operating in different times and spaces, and I don't think we have that opportunity. That may say something about where art is or performance is in cultural life, which is not to say this doesn't have an effect. One of the things that's happened as a consequence of Headless doing what it does is to start to open dialogue with the finance industry. This was kind of uncomfortable at the start. I mentioned at the beginning that they were threatened legally for certain activities. What then happened was that Sovereign Trust realized that suing them was going to be a very bad idea because it would go public very quickly, and PR-wise it was going to be terrible. Goldin+Senneby actually submitted Headless to the Sovereign Art Prize just to wind them up even more. But what then happened was that Howard Bilton, who is the chief executive of Sovereign Trust, invited a spokesperson, not me, a different one, to fly to Hong Kong to interview him about contemporary art and a little tiny bit about Headless. And so what started to happen was much more of a dialogic relationship with the industry. It's not dominant, nor are they seeking to be dominant in any sense. Whether cumulatively the ideas that are unleashed in Bataille terms by the project will have a purchase on the world, I don't know. But the project certainly has become quite well known and has started to appear all over the place. So not dominant, but hopefully it will have some dent in the world. I don't know how much.
Well, one can always be a good dominatrix.
Oh, I shall certainly try. There was another
I
one?
think we had another question here. I'll give you the microphone.
So, if the artist novel really has this paradoxical quality of being nothing and something at the same time, what does that say about the book lovers, which attempts to be a systematic study of something that eventually can't be like historicized or formalized? Or, I mean, how does that undermine the whole project of the book lovers?
I don't think it undermines it. The paradox of the artist novel is that because it avoids the novelist, in a sense, it undermines the form of the novel. You could argue that about the novel itself. There's plenty of novels that are written by ghostwriters or by pseudonymous people or by groups of people. So the novel itself is not a fixed category that somehow the artist novel is entirely divergent from. What the artist novel does, on one reading anyway, is particularly to reflect on the novel. It reflects on all sorts of other things as well. It reflects on its own form, this kind of self-annihilating paradox of the novel that looks like a novel, but what's actually important is the process of production rather than the thing at the end. Because what most novelists do is write a novel for the thing at the end, rather than for the process. Many artist novels, many of the ones upstairs, certainly Headless, the purpose is not the object at the end, the purpose is the process. But there is also the object at the end. So to go back to Kali's quote about it not being fully ontological, in many ways, it redoubles the ontology. It gives it multiple ontologies all at the same time and stretched out over time. It doesn't undermine the project at all. I think it makes the theoretical work of the project much harder. Sorry. But, you know, that's the excitement of it. That's why it's extraordinary that nobody has done what David and Joanna are doing until now, and makes it, I think, really fascinating that they're doing it, because I think the theoretical work that can come out of this about the nature of the novel is only just beginning. There's a huge wealth there to be uncovered, so it's not undermined.
In that respect, it might be a misleading title also, because it's focused on this object, on the book lovers. It says book lovers, and I think we really have to make the difference between the book and writing, the process of writing. I mean,
yes, I don't know how explicit that can be. I love the book lovers as title. That's fantastic. I think, you know, no, don't change that, whatever you do. But yes, I mean, I think everything that it does, the artist novel, you simply cannot take it as just the object. Not least because some of them are dreadful. Some of them are really badly written. But some of them are brilliant. And some of them are fantastic novels in their own sense. I mean, what Goldin+Senneby wanted Headless to be once it's finished, and I should say for those of you who don't know, it's not yet published. It is, I think, about to be published, but I'm not part of that process, so I don't know. I just get stabbed and get left in London Zoo. But what they originally intended was that it would be a kind of sub-Dan Brown trashy thriller that would be on every newsstand, in every station, and it would actually have mass market potential. The difficulty there is actually not the public, but the people who stand between novelists and the public, which are the publicists and the publishers, because although they put it through mainstream publishers, they all wanted changes, and the main change they wanted was the art part of the artist novel removed. I'm pretty sure I would have been cut out by the marketing people very, very promptly. And of course that, for them, would defeat the object of the novel. And so there has to have been a compromise at some point so that an object appears that doesn't compromise precisely that relationship to process that produced it. So I think the nature of these objects is a very fragile one and a very difficult one. And there are very few that have had any kind of mass market appeal. I mean, Rena Spalling's, some of you might have read, the Bernadette Corporation, who we don't like, have got some purchase, and the other one is the Wu Ming Foundation, who published a number of these novels, starting with Luther Blissett, and I can't remember the name of the most recent one, but they actually have sold some to proper people, not just artists. So there's a huge spectrum of types and qualities to the artist novel that I think this project very valuably explores.